The airplane that would decide the fate of a superweapon did not look like a machine of the future. It looked like a leftover from a barnstorming fair. Two wings laced with struts and wires, a fixed spindly undercarriage, an open cockpit that let North Atlantic spray slap the crews in the face. It wore fabric over a metal skeleton, the way an old tent wraps a frame, and it moved through the sky at a pace that made seagulls look cocky. Yet this biplane had a job. The Fairy Swordfish was, on paper, a 1,930 seconds torpedo bomber and spotter. In reality, it was a tool the Royal Navy could trust to leave a carrier deck in bad weather, fly when newer designs were sulking in hangars, and do the one thing that mattered during a chase across cold water: put a heavy torpedo into the sea at the right speed, the right height, and the right angle so it would run straight and bite. That is the key. Not glamour, not speed. Delivery. To understand why anyone ever kept such a creature alive as monoplanes took over the world, you have to picture a carrier at sea in rough weather. The deck is a pitching rectangle that rises and drops like a stubborn elevator that missed too many inspections. A modern, fast, slick aircraft demands runway length and stable winds and timing down to a breath. The Swordfish forgave. It could lift off at low speed, barely trotting into the wind. It stalled late and softly. Its crews could see the spray and the horizon without a canopy fogging their world. It could pull its torpedo free of the rack and send it into grey water without skipping it like a stone. It was a specialist that survived because the sea punishes generalists. Across that same sea ran a ship that made admirals swallow hard. The battleship Bismarck wasn't just steel, it was message. Size mattered because size held armour and guns and boilers and prestige. It was a promise that a fleet could cut open the lanes that fed an island nation. It could outrun trouble. It could choose its battles. And, at the moment when this story begins, it had already blown a hole through a symbol, sending the pride of another navy to the bottom with a blast that shook more than a fleet's order of battle. When a ship like that moves, you don't ask if it's fast. You ask if anyone can force it to turn. You ask who can reach its nerves. That is the collision set before us, a flying anachronism with canvas wings and a cockpit that smelled like oil and cold air, and a fast, armoured, angry ship whose very shape said, "Come and stop me if you can." The world loves obvious matchups, air against armour, new against old. But wars run on fit. The Swordfish fit the one job no one else could promise on schedule: getting a torpedo into the water under a low cloud ceiling and making it behave. It is tempting to say this was an accident of history, that the right tool met the right problem by luck. But the crews strapped into those open cockpits weren't lucky charm mascots. They were trained for night landings, for long, shivering patrols on the edge of cloud and sea, for torpedo runs where every foot of altitude and every knot of speed mattered. They understood that a torpedo, before it becomes a threat, is just a heavy tube that hates bad inputs. It wants to be dropped not too fast, not too high, with a gentle entry that lets it dive, stabilize, and arm. Speeds that thrill crowds during air shows can ruin a weapon that needs water, not applause. So the story opens with a paradox. The biplane looks like the past, but its habits belong to the job at hand. The superweapon looks like the future, but its weak point is old as ships, steering and survivability in a chase when many hunters close from many angles. There is one more layer. Weather does not care about reputation. Low cloud and rain erase fancy sightlines and make rugged, slow, and obedient machines the adults in the room. The Swordfish, with its big wings and gentle manners, could live under weather that made faster designs. Sigh. That is not romance. It is the physics of wings that don't stall easily, and crews who learn to trust their hands. Set the table then. An island empire must close a corridor before a wounded giant reaches a coast where repair yards wait. Cruisers keep contact, but contact is not decision. Heavy ships hurry, but speed without a mechanism to force a turn is just speed toward a faint wake on dark water. Somewhere behind sheets of rain, pilots wearing thick gloves and leather helmets will line up a torpedo run the way a carpenter lines up a chisel before one honest strike. If they do that one thing right, the physics will take over. A damaged rudder is not a press clipping, it is a verdict. A battleship that cannot choose its own heading is already halfway to the end. The biplane was never meant to be beautiful to eyes that loved sleek lines. It was meant to be useful to sailors who counted miles to dusk and miles to dawn. It had a crew of 3 when the load demanded it: pilot, observer, and a man at the rear gun who doubled as a second set of nerves. They strapped in with the kind of quiet you only see in people who have repeated a checklist enough times to make ritual and realism the same. The engine coughed and caught. The deck crew signalled with hands, with wands, with a glance at the windsock that confessed what the clouds already threatened. The takeoff roll seemed too short until the wings said, "Fine, we'll carry you anyway," and the aircraft walked off the deck into a world of spray and grey. That first image stays with you because it frames everything that follows. What looks weak can be strong in the right frame. What looks unstoppable can be cornered by physics used with discipline. The Swordfish was an old key that still fit a new lock. It would be judged not by heritage, but by whether it could deliver a simple cylinder of metal into the sea in such a way that it ran straight and hit where steering matters. That is the job. All the noise in the world can't change that. And when the chase is on, and the hunters are counting the hours before weather changes again, and the radios carry bad news and good news with the same clipped calm, the airplane that can still climb off a wet deck at low speed and come back with salt dried on its leading edges is the airplane you keep. Mock it if you want. It will be the last laugh you get before metal meets water and water meets ship. Before you can measure the moment when a slow biplane matters, you have to feel why the target seemed beyond anyone's power to stop. A big battleship at sea is more than a number of guns or inches of armor. It is a moving geometry problem that favors the ship that can choose when and where to fight. This one carried long, clean lines that cut the water at a speed that made convoys feel naked. Its armor was layered to shrug off the kinds of hits most enemies could deliver at the ranges they could achieve in the weather they were likely to face. Its fire control promised order amid the thunder of salvos. And in the opening act of its breakout, it fought a duel that ended with a flash and a column of smoke so tall that a whole nation felt it in the throat. When the sea swallows a famous name, the psychology of a campaign changes overnight. There is a specific terror in a fast raider. It multiplies choices. Surface groups must reposition, and every hour lost to uncertainty is a day the raider can angle toward safety. Submarines cannot sprint to intercept. Land-based bombers cannot grow new wings to reach farther. Even a well-handled cruiser that shadows at the edge of sight is only a witness without a way to force a decision. The public imagines a chase as ships pounding at full speed until someone catches someone else. Professionals know that catching is not the same as controlling. To control a ship like this, you have to bend its path. You have to make it turn at your command, not its captain's. Otherwise, it will cheat you on range, bearing, and the clock. Armor invites myths. People like to say unbeatable. The truth is duller and sharper at once. Armor is a bet. You hope your enemy will strike where you are strongest, at angles that favor you, with weapons that don't quite match your protection. You hope the sea stays calm enough to let your directors read the line of fall and apply clever mathematics. You hope your damage control teams never meet a problem that creeps into steering and power at the same time. Hope, unfortunately, has a hard time with torpedoes that enter water cleanly and run straight under foam where angles are mean. Armor solves one family of problems and leaves others waiting politely for their turn. The terror reached beyond metal. It lived in calendars and maps. If the raider could reach a coast where repair yards, air cover, and narrow seas made pursuit impractical, it would return stronger. Every convoy in the North Atlantic would sail with a heavier sense of risk. Every escort commander would imagine a column of water rising at the wrong place. It wasn't only about a single ship. It was about freedom of movement, and the message that even the fastest hunter in your packs could be embarrassed by a sprinting wolf. That message costs fuel, sleep, and confidence long after the guns fall silent. Technology praise adds another layer of fog. Newer is treated as a spell. Newer guns, newer optics, newer engines. but the sea has a way of resetting the scoreboard to tasks. Can your aircraft launch in foul weather and aim a torpedo with a calm hand when the horizon is ragged with rain? Can your cruiser keep contact without being blinded by its own spray? Can your battleship arrive before night and storm weld the door shut? The ship with the finest range tables is still, in the end, a hull that needs a sky window and an enemy who cannot turn fast enough to ruin your plot. So the hype was not childish. It was earned. The ship was fast, and the ocean is big, and its first duel had turned out like a nightmare for the other side. Every telegraph key tapping the news onto a desk built the sense that this was a problem without a clean solution. Yet there is a quiet place where hype cannot enter, the checklists of people who deliver weapons. A torpedo's arming distance does not care about headlines. The height of a drop does not change because a ship has a name that sounds like thunder. The speed of an aircraft at the instant of release is either inside the envelope or outside it. If you spend your hour thinking about reputation, you will throw away the only leverage you possess, which is the discipline to put the weapon into the water the way the weapon demands. That is where the mismatch becomes beautiful. The Raider's strength was the ability to dictate engagement, but it could not dictate the weather. It could not dictate the short field of a carrier deck. It could not dictate the patience of crews who trained to fly low, slow, and steady in air that wanted to slap them sideways. It could outrun a shadow, but not the geometry of a torpedo that began its life with a careful, almost tender entry. And if one such weapon found a nerve and damaged the ability to steer, speed would become a trap. You cannot run away in a straight line forever if the wheel in your own hands says no. There is a final reason the hype mattered. It forced the hunters to clear their heads. When fear is loud, plans must be simple. Keep contact. Close the net. Trust the one tool that does not need a perfect sky. The Swordfish crews did not waste words on whether they looked modern. They strapped into their old-souled machines and flew with the knowledge that the sea had no favorites, only conditions. If those conditions tilted the table toward a fabric-covered set of wings on that particular day, then the newest pride of a fleet would learn an old lesson the hard way. No ship is safe from the right problem. Patiently delivered. The strength of the Swordfish begins with the thing most pilots of fast aircraft dislike: low speed. Low speed is normally a penalty. It stretches transit times and makes you vulnerable to fighters. It gives you long minutes in flak when seconds would be kinder. But a torpedo is not a shell fired from a gun. It enters water, stumbles through a short, chaotic dive, recovers, runs, and only then becomes the threat you paid for. A fast aircraft tempts its crew to drop too quick and too high. The wake is harder to judge. The waves look like a flickering carpet. The torpedo slaps in and skips. The clever people who designed the weapon wrote a quiet rule across the inside of the airplane's cockpit, whether anyone read it or not. Please be gentle. The Swordfish made gentle easy. Those wings are generous. They produce lift at speeds that seem silly in a world of racers. The stall whispers rather than bites. The aircraft can fly under a low ceiling without fear of a sudden sink that ruins a run. The pilot can hold a height so steady that the altimeter needle looks indecisive. The observer has time to read the sea and the target's angle. The rear gunner, whose hands also work the radio and the nerves of the crew, watches the sky behind and the glinting water below. The wind claws at their faces, but air you feel is also air you understand. A closed canopy isolates. An open cockpit makes the weather a partner you grudgingly respect. Deck handling matters as much as aerial grace. A carrier is a factory for cycles. Fuel, arm, launch, recover. The Swordfish asks little. It can trundle into position and leave the deck with a short run and a headwind that would shame more modern designs. It does not need the perfect timing of a complex catapult if the crew judges the wind, and it will come back with the same humility, dangling a hook toward wires that dance above a deck that heaves. When a ship must launch in a weather window that might close, the airplane that shrugs at gusts is worth more than a technical miracle that refuses to play. Doctrine grows from habits like these. Crews train at night because the sea often takes its curtain down early. They practice low-level approaches because waves and rain hide them well enough to matter. They rehearse the drop until the motion chain becomes a single, smooth stroke. Line up on the target's predicted path, correct for wind and drift, check height, check speed, arm, breathe once, and let the torpedo fall as if setting a heavy tool gently on a workbench. The airplane won't lurch. The pilot won't fight a twitchy wing. The observer will call the timing in a voice that has learned not to rise at the end of a sentence. The rear gunner will count seconds and watch for the little bloom of water that means the weapon entered right. Fit extends beyond the airplane itself. A carrier like Ark Royal carries crews who know each other's habits, down to the way a man tightens his straps before a launch. The armourers who heave the torpedo into place share jokes with the men who will depend on their alignment. The deck hands read the sky the way farmers read soil. The bridge knows how long to hold a course into wind to make a launch safe without wandering into danger. In that web of patience, the older aircraft is not a burden. It is a machine that does not surprise the people who serve it. On the other side of the ledger, the enemy's strengths are real. Speed threatens to shear the geometry of every attack run. Guns make the space around the ship bitter. But even speed must submit to rudder and propeller shafts and the real limits of mechanical steering gear. A torpedo need not break armor if it can punch where armor thins or where shock travels into linkages and bends judgment into compulsion. This is why the fit is perfect. The Swordfish does not promise spectacle. It promises placement. If it delivers a hit near the stern, the sea will do the rest, converting damage into a slowly tightening noose. People sometimes ask why a more modern aircraft did not take the task. The answer stands on the deck while spray flies. Modern aircraft of the day were faster and sleeker and wonderful for many roles. But on the evening, when the weather lay like a damp blanket and the target ran under low cloud, the machine with big wings and easy manners could still fly a straight, low line long enough to make precision real. That is not to insult newer designs. It is to say the job chose its servant, not the other way around. So the plan forms in the calm that comes when you stop arguing with a problem's shape. Find the target. Keep it in view through shadow and squall. Launch the aircraft that can fly in the available sky. Put the torpedo where it must go. And if the first try fails, try again, because the airplane can cycle and the crews can endure. Endurance is also a weapon. An enemy under pressure for hours makes mistakes. A steering gear that took a glancing knock can worsen with strain. Each sortie is a question asked politely with a heavy answer at the end. When you look at photographs of the Swordfish, you might still smile. It looks like a memory already fading at the time it flew. But crews do not fly pictures. They fly physics, weather, and schedules. The airplane's low stall speed is a fact. Its docile handling is a fact. Its ability to leave a short deck in rough air is a fact. You stack those facts and they begin to look like intent. The intent, simple and hard, is to put a torpedo into the water properly in the one window the sea will grant. That is the tool fitting the job, as clean as a wrench finding a stubborn nut. The ocean does not present a stage with a spotlight when history wants a scene. It throws curtains of rain and low cloud and makes the horizon a rumour. On the day the hunters closed, contact began not with a parade but with a tired voice on a wireless set and a position that moved every time someone plotted it. A flying boat, broad-winged and stubborn, sighted the radar through a break in the weather and marked it with a message that sounded too simple for the weight it carried. A cruiser, tense and grey, kept its distance, eyes on the enemy and on the sky where help might come. The help needed a deck and a wind, and men who would accept that the first attempt might teach them more than it hurt the target. This is what pursuit looks like when conditions are poor, a chain of modest acts that, together, build pressure. On the carrier, the order to fly felt like a release and a dare. Deck crews ran with the purposeful economy of people who can perform their jobs in darkness without banging shins. The Swordfish rolled into position, wings already extended and braced. The engine's growl did not promise glory. It promised torque and a steady pull. The pilot glanced at the wind, at the wands in the deck handler's hands, at the edge where the world fell into grey. Then the brake let go, and the aircraft began its little climb toward a sky that did not want it. The first group left into a headwind that slapped and shifted, then dropped into a lower layer where rain made beads on goggles and the sea looked like hammered lead. Bad weather amplifies risk and hides mistakes. The formation spread wider than anyone liked, then tightened again when the leader flashed a signal and the wingmen responded with patience. The target was somewhere ahead under cloud, moving fast, throwing spray from a bow that cut like a hatchet. It had guns. More important in that moment, it had speed, and a captain who understood that a torpedo bomber wants a straight line the way a sprinter wants a stable lane. So the ship swerved and corrected, and made the air above it dirty with bursts that looked small from a distance and felt personal up close. The crews lowered into their run with the kind of calm that comes only when you have decided to accept the worst that could happen and focus on one clean job. First attempts in war are often cautionary tales. Misidentification stalks, chases where rain and speed combine, and a hunter can lunge at the wrong shadow, correct, and live with the memory. Friendly hulls are not supposed to carry the burden of dodging friendly weapons, but the fog of combat is not an abstraction. It is a note in a logbook that says an attack went in on a shape that turned out to be yours, and only luck and quick recognition prevented a tragedy. That near miss bleached everyone's faces and sharpened everyone's minds. It is one thing to fear the enemy. It is another to realize that pressure can make hands shake in a way no checklist can smooth. They turned again. They found the right wake. The second approach went in against the true target, the one they had crossed miles to reach. The swordfish came in low, the pilots holding a fragile height over a sea, eager to pull them down. The observers called ranges and angles that changed too fast to enjoy. The rear gunners watched the little black specks of bursts stitch the air and thought about the men below who saw them as silhouettes to be swatted. At the point of release, there is a quiet that does not match the noise of the engine or the storm. It is the quiet of decision, when the pilot says, "Here," and the torpedo drops like an answer given without drama. Splashes marked entries that were not all perfect, because perfection is a rumor in weather like this. But some were good. Some were clean. The target twisted and ran and made distance, and for a few minutes the sky behind the swordfish was a place you leave gratefully. Fuel is the enemy of time. After an attack, there is the long turn back toward the carrier and the harder work of landing on a deck that pitches. The crews counted the miles, felt the stiffness in their fingers, and thought about the next launch even as their wheels kissed wood and the hook snared a wire with a jerk that cracked through their spines. On the hangar deck, armourers worked with the efficiency of men who do not ask the sea for an easier day. An attack that braced the target without crippling it is not a failure. It is a rehearsal that taught the enemy what to expect and showed the crews what the sea would allow. They would adjust. They would squeeze height and speed a little tighter. They would trust that weather, ugly and unfair, can also be a friend if you move under it rather than through it. Night lurked. The horizon blurred into a smear that told truth without offering comfort. The carrier's bridge weighed the risk of another strike against the certainty that dawn would bring both chances and heavier opposition. The decision to go again came not from daredevil impulse, but from arithmetic. The window was here. The enemy was hurt only in nerves and paint. If steering remained perfect, the raider could still make a coastline that would write new lines of grief into the logbooks of convoy escorts for months to come. If steering faltered, even a little, the hunters would own the morning. That is the difference between a chase and a capture at sea. The condition of a piece of machinery at the back of a ship where the propeller shafts drive water into foam. The swordfish crews ate what they could and checked straps and walked their machines with gloved hands as if talking to horses before a climb. There is a ritual in touching struts and wires and making sure the torpedo sits right under the belly, fins straight, nose fairing aligned, safety pins handled with respect. The second launch felt like a memory of the first, except now the sky carried the scent of what could happen if one hit found a nerve. The men did not speak in big statements. They repeated simple words about height and speed and throttle and trim. In rough air, simple words keep people alive. First contact is rarely decisive. It is a set of notes that say who can live in the weather and who flinches. It tells the enemy that you have a tool they mocked but must now respect. It tells your own side that misidentification is a ghost you can banish with better discipline and a calmer eye. It frames the next act. The next act, when they went again through curtains of rain toward a ship that thought speed could solve everything, would be the moment when the old tool would do the job it had been kept for all along. Not a kill, but a turning of the key in the lock of steering. And from that turn, the end would follow on rails. No battleship, however proud, could bend back straight. A torpedo looks simple when you see it on a trolley. It is a steel cylinder with fins and a warhead, and a propeller that will churn for a fixed span of time. But a torpedo is not a bullet. It is a swimmer with bad manners, and swimmers have to enter the water on terms they can handle. If it hits the surface too fast, it slaps, digs its nose, or bounces into a useless tumble. If it falls from too high, it dives too deep and spends precious seconds recovering to the level where a ship's belly lives. That is why the math of a torpedo run is the quiet center of this story. The numbers are modest height, measured in tens of feet, speed measured in the low end of an airman's pride, but those modest numbers decide whether steel meets steel or only water. And the swordfish, with its kind manners and broad wings, was a machine built to respect modesty. The swordfish crews carried numbers in their heads the way sailors carry the heights of masts and bridges. Drop too fast, and the torpedo's gyro will fight a losing battle with chaos. Drop too high, and the arc on entry becomes violent enough to bend a fin and spoil the run. The manuals translated those limits into speeds and heights that sounded almost laughably cautious to men raised on speed. But cautious is steady, and steady is lethal when a target is twisting, when spray is kicking in the wind, and when the horizon opens and closes like a pair of grey jaws. The sea is not a level bench. Waves lift, shoulder, and fall, and a torpedo that enters at the peak of one wave will meet a different world than a torpedo that enters in the trough. The crews learned to watch the pattern, to time the release, so the weapon slipped into the back of a wave rather than the front of a whitecap that could pitch it. At the same time, the target is changing course, testing the angle of approach, trying to ruin the geometry with a last-minute turn. The observer reads that dance with the cool of someone counting beats in a piece of music. The pilot feels the lift bloom and fade, the small buffets that tell him the wind is forming teeth. He trims a click. He nudges the throttle. He keeps the nose low enough to make the water look like a surface, not an idea. On land, you can practice with chalk lines and stopwatches. At sea, the wind tears your notes away and writes its own. The swordfish had an advantage the manuals barely describe: tactile bandwidth. With an open cockpit and a slow, obedient wing, the pilot felt gusts a moment before the gauges reacted. He could nudge the nose in anticipation, not in surprise. That mattered because the difference between a torpedo that runs true and a torpedo that porpoises is often the difference between a release made half a heartbeat early or late. The crew built that half heartbeat into their ritual. They trained to make the airplane fly itself for a few seconds, to take hands off the yoke and truss trim so the sight picture would stay still long enough to let the weapon go. There is also the matter of arming distance. A torpedo does not wake ready to explode. It wakes clumsy, then recovers, then arms, like a boxer stepping through ropes and finding his feet. Too short a run before impact and the warhead arrives asleep. Too long and the ship has time to dodge. The envelope then is not only height and speed but also range. The pilot resists the urge to press in too close, where flak thickens and water gets mean, and he resists the fear that makes a man drop long where the weapon will pass gently under a stern like a polite guest. He aims for the place where the arithmetic of arming and the geometry of a turn meet. Now put those numbers into the day that matters. Low cloud means the attack must be flown at a height already close to the release band. Rain means visibility flickers. You cannot rely on a perfect sight picture for long. Sea state means the surface acts like broken glass. The target's speed means angles close and open, with a cruelty that makes the throat tight. And yet the swordfish holds its line, as if the world were calmer than it is. The crew treats the math like a ritual, not because numbers are holy, but because ritual protects judgment when noise is loud. Height, speed, bearing, release. Height, speed, bearing, release. It is boring to read and beautiful to perform. This is why the language of miracle does this story a disservice. The hit that matters later is not magic. It emerges from the discipline of dozens of practice drops, from instructors who shouted about an inch too high and a knot too fast, from hands that learned to trim an airplane to fly itself for a few seconds so the pilot could look at nothing but the sight. The numbers the crew kept in the front of their minds were not charms. They were gates that kept chaos out long enough to place a cylinder of steel in a stripe of water at the right time. The swordfish's design turns out to be a set of sympathetic compromises with the ocean. Its low stall speed keeps the wing honest at a height where the difference between a swell and a mistake is 3 feet. Its sturdy gear forgives landings on a deck that behaves like bad masonry. Its engine delivers power with a farmer's patience rather than a racer's tantrum. Each of those features would earn only polite applause at an air show. Together they form a personality suited to the terrible kindness a torpedo run demands. A final truth about torpedo math is that the sea takes its fee. Even a perfect drop can meet a bubble of bad luck, a swirling eddy that twists a rudder at the wrong instant, or a wake that pulls the nose just enough to pass astern. That is why attacks come in groups. One weapon carries a possibility. Many weapons form a pattern through which the target must pass, and the odds begin to favor the patient. The swordfish could not promise that any single torpedo would be the one. It could promise repetitions, flown inside the envelope, until the sea's fee was paid and the geometry yielded. And so the arithmetic becomes an ethic. Respect the limits, keep the ritual, share the courage across a formation so no one man's luck decides a fleet's fortune. When you look at the track the torpedoes cut through grey water, you are not looking at chance. You are looking at discipline rendered visible, a set of quiet choices stretched across a mile of sea. The ship ahead can laugh at the airplane. It cannot laugh at the math. The decision to go again was made in the narrow country between caution and necessity. The carrier could feel the sea hunching under her keel, and every man on the bridge knew that the longer they waited, the stronger the wind's argument would become. But contact was still good, and the hunters had learned from the first run what the sky would give and what it would not. The second strike would not be a replay staged for clearer cameras. It would be a threading, an attempt to slip fabric wings through ragged curtains and put steel into water in the one corridor the weather allowed. Engines turned and the deck crew moved with that controlled haste that never becomes hurry. Torpedoes hung cold and heavy. Safety pins were pulled with care, arming wires checked by touch as much as by eye. The pilots climbed aboard with the same deliberate motions as before, but now there was a change only they could feel. The memory of how the wind lay along the deck, the taste of the lower layer where the rain felt like needles, the timing of the gusts over stayer, the bow. Knowledge turned fear into attention. You cannot banish risk, you can make it skittish. Below, the ocean had become a field of muscle. Swells shouldered each other, white water dragged itself across their backs. The swordfish dropped lower than pride would advise and flew into the veins of the rain. Inland pilots talk about flying under the weather as if it were a trick. At sea, under weather is a workplace. The horizon shrank until it was something you could almost put your hand on, a grey bar that hid as much as it revealed. In that tunnel, formation meant trust more than geometry. Wingmen flew on the leader's consistency, not on the map's idea of neatness. The target, warned by the first attack, zigzagged with a violence that felt like contempt. It threw arcs of white from its bow and stern, and the wake braided behind it like a tangled rope. Guns barked into sky they could barely see, lifting puffs of angry cotton that flattened and tore in the rain. Every change, of course, was a gamble. Every gamble sought the one outcome that mattered: ruin the approach math, force the aircraft to drop outside the band, make the pilot flinch early or late. That is the duel within the dual ship's cunning against aviators' discipline. The run-in lasted longer than the clocks said. The pilot rowed the swordfish, as if it were a small boat that happened to fly, loose in the shoulders, firm in the hands, trimming and retrimming to keep the nose from hunting. The observer called the drift and the bearing and the dogleg he could see forming in the ship's path as its captain tried to trap the attackers into bad geometry. The rear gunner kept his mouth shut because this was the part of the flight where words unneeded were words unwise. He watched the ship grow, not larger but truer. At the crucial moment, the world simplifies. The line of attack becomes a promise you either keep or break. The ship ahead shows a sliver of stern wider than before as a turn begins. The pilot decides not to be teased into a correction that will overshoot and leave the weapon astern. He holds. He holds a breath, not because breath affects aim, but because every muscle in the human body wants to join the decision and must be told to wait. The release is not a throw, it is a letting go. The torpedo drops, kisses water, vanishes, and leaves only a seam that looks too fragile to matter. They pull away into their own weather, climbing a few feet, not a dozen, because altitude is expensive and flak is cheap. The rear gunner sees the torpedo's track as a pale seam in the grey and tries not to will it into luck. Wishing is for later. Now is for turning a fragile airplane into a moving question mark, a target not worth a director's effort. The observer twists to watch the ship, to read the story in spray and smoke, to see if a puff near the stern becomes a bloom. And if a bloom becomes a surge, that means metal has been told a secret it does not like. One hit in a sea this big feels small until its consequences unfold. A detonation near the tail of a fast ship is like a fist closing on tendons. Shock travels through steel and finds the parts that convert captain's intent into rudder angle. Shafts that must stay straight take a jolt they were never meant to feel. Bearings frown. Linkages sulk. Something somewhere binds or bends. And then a ship that a moment ago answered her helm with the sharpness of a sword begins to hesitate, then obeys with a lag, then adds an unwanted opinion to every command. It is not theatrical. It is worse. It feels like handcuffs on the wheel. The swordfish do not linger. They leave the scene to the enemy and to their own side's destroyers, who have been waiting like wolves who know the terrain. The pilots fly home with the mixed nausea that always follows a run, the body's slow argument with adrenaline, the brain's sudden room for images that were barred during the approach, the hunger that arrives, rudely because it was, sent away earlier. Their wheels find wood again, hooks bite wires again. Men slap shoulders without words because words would let something roar out of its cage. Threading a storm means accepting that you never owned the sky. You rented a corridor through it long enough to do your work. The second strike did not look glorious. It looked stubborn. It looked like fabric and wire and courage used correctly. If the target's stern carried a wound now, the entire geometry of the pursuit changed from a hunt to a harvest. You harvest at dawn, when big guns can see, but the harvest hangs on a job done in rain, at low speed, by hands that kept faith with their training when the weather took away every comfort. Damage at sea is a rumor until it becomes a pattern. After the detonation, the first reports were cautious, almost bored. A splash near the stern. An odd response from the wheel. A corrective order repeated twice. No one declares a ship doomed on the strength of a thump and a feeling. Systems are redundant. Metal forgives a little. Crews are talented at talking themselves out of panic, but patterns ignore pride. The ship tried to take a bearing with its old crispness and found that its stern carried an opinion. It began to answer the helm the way a tired horse answers reins, not immediately, not cleanly, and not always in the direction desired. Steering gear is a plain phrase for a web of parts that must act as one. Rudder posts, quadrants, chains, hydraulic rams, linkages, and the long, indifferent strength of a shaft turning a propeller each has to stay within tolerances that are small compared to the size of the ship they serve. A shock near the stern forces tolerances to confess their margins. Metal that lives happily under steady load resents a sideways punch. Bolts that would last a voyage stretch a hair. The sum of hairline shifts is disobedience, and disobedience in steering turns a captain's will into a suggestion. From outside, this translates into geometry. A ship meant to hold a course begins to draw a curve. The helmsman fights the curve until fighting becomes the job and the course becomes a hope. Speed that once guaranteed choice now multiplies the mistake. At high speed, the rudder force grows wild, and the wounded parts complain louder. Slow enough to nurse the gear, and you become meat for the hunters who are closing their trap from over the horizon. The captain's world shrinks to ugly options. Run fast and break yourself, or slow down and let them find the range. The sea is full of listeners. Shadowing cruisers read the pattern in their own wakes as they match the enemy's drift. A destroyer captain reads the angle of smoke and the thickening of foam and says, "She isn't choosing that heading, it's being chosen for her." Airmen overhead, even in poor light, learn to trust the language of wakes the way trackers trust bent grass. You cannot hide a steering wound for long. The ocean writes it in cursive for everyone to read. Inside the wounded ship, professionalism masks dread. Damage control parties race aft, counting decks and frames, feeling for heat and listening to the grumble of a bearing that a few hours ago sang like a hymn. Men crawl where there is just enough room and just enough light and just enough time. They check rams, they check linkages, they check for flooding that might shift weight and make a good man's calculations useless. They report to an officer who stands in a space that smells of hot oil and asks for temperatures, clearances, degrees of freedom, and gets answers that make him calm his voice on purpose. News travels outward like heat. The hunters do not know the exact nouns used below decks, but they learn the gist. The ship that was a sprinting threat is now a limping symbol. She can still kill up close, but she can no longer choose who gets close. Radio circuits remain spare and cruel. Contact maintained. Maneuvering appears restricted. Speed variable. In destroyer. Wardrooms. Coffee stands. Untouched as men play through the night. Attack that now becomes not a gesture, but a duty. The heavy ships that once feared arriving late now study the sky for a cooperative morning. None of this has the glamour that attaches to famous exchanges of gunfire. There is no photograph of a steering quadrant admitting failure. There is no newsreel of a bearing deciding to run hot, but the ocean is indifferent to what men can film. It respects only what men can make work and work again, and keep working under load. On this day, the humble and the hidden had their say. A biplane's slow approach enabled a clean entry. A warhead bit near a place where armor is thinner and functions are concentrated. After that, the mathematics of pursuit took over and never let go. When the sun went down, the hunters did not grow sentimental. Destroyers nipped and harried in the dark, trading shots and spray, but their real purpose was to write time into the ledger. Each hour in company is an hour the wounded ship must admit it has not slipped the net. Each burst of gunfire is a reminder that noise and exhaustion are tools. Men on the target slept in jolts, if they slept at all. Their ears tuned to changes in vibration that might mean a bearing had seized or a bracket had surrendered. The difference between a fighting ship and a haunted one is measured in the confidence of its metal. Dawn would matter because vision would matter. The big ships wanted a clean sky to finish what arithmetic had started. But the hit that mattered had already done its true work in the machinery space and in the minds of men reading awake. In that sense, the decision point lay not at the moment of impact, but at the moment the captain admitted to himself that choice had left the bridge. Speed without steering is an oath spoken into the wind. The sea does not hear it. It hears only the groan of overworked metal and the patient approach of enemies who do not need to be brilliant, only present. By midnight, the verdict was clear to anyone who could read wakes and listen to engines. The ship still fought, but the sea had taken away its freedom to choose. That is all strategy. Ever asks of a small tool used, well impose a limit, turn swagger into arithmetic, and make tomorrow predictable enough for slower, heavier friends to arrive and finish what patience began at scale. Morning at sea is a judgment. The light lifts itself out of grey water and spreads along the curves of swell, and every shape reveals whether it is hunter or hunted. When dawn came, the escorts had already done their night's work, chivying and marking and refusing to be dismissed. The wounded ship lay under a sky that promised no favours. It could steam, it could fight, but it could not decide, and deciding is how fast ships live. The circle had closed, not because anyone wished it so, but because geometry and time had become partners. Destroyers took positions that looked casual and were anything but. They worried the edges, forcing the wounded ship into small adjustments that cost disproportionate attention. A man can juggle 2 balls and walk, add a third and a curb to step over, and the trick turns into labour. So it was with the wounded helm. Every shell splash near the bow asked for a nudge, and every nudge exposed the limits of the gear aft. Above, aircraft peered through gaps in the weather to confirm what the water already told. The wake recorded hesitation, and hesitation is a drag no engine can overcome. To the west lay the hope of a coastline, and airfields, and narrow seas that would complicate pursuit. Hope is a compass bearing until machinery steals it. Speed charts written in peacetime assume obedience. They do not include the line that says, "If your rudder answers when it feels like it, subtract the part of your soul that relied on plans." The captain knew this. He had a map covered in grease pencil lines and a head covered in the weight of men who deserved another morning. He also had a wheel that ghosted left when asked to hold right, and a stern that sulked. The hunters used the only luxury war rarely grants: time. Time allowed bigger ships to approach with their own nerves in order, crews fed and briefed, ranges calculated without hurry. It allowed messages to travel that said, "Hold position, conserve men and fuel. We will arrive when the light is high enough to write our names." It allowed small mistakes to fade in importance because statistics reward persistence more than brilliance when one side cannot leave. In the wardrooms of the approaching capital ships, officers who respected history drank weak tea and rehearsed procedures in voices designed to calm hands more than hearts. Even inevitability has its rituals. Gunnery officers checked mechanisms that had worked yesterday and would work today if treated with the respect a machine demands. Lookouts rubbed eyes and looked again, not because the shape on the horizon might change species, but because men still owe the sea a second glance. Signalmen rehearsed sequences of flags for contingencies everyone hoped would not occur. Each small act, done well, tightens the circle another inch. There is a comfort to this. When the outcome is no longer in doubt, you still honor the craft that brings it about. For the crew inside the wounded ship, the world shrank to compartments, frames, and tasks too ordinary to carry the name fate. Someone checked a gasket. Someone pumped a bilge that insisted on refilling. Someone cut a piece of timber to wedge a piece of metal that preferred to move. They were busy with the plain work that keeps a ship alive in bad weather or good, and for a while that work is enough to keep catastrophe at bay. But the ocean speaks in accumulated terms. A bearing too warm at midnight is a bearing angry at noon. The sound of a bracket fretting at dawn is the sound of a bracket failing when the first salvos land. Around them, the weather performed its own drama without choosing a side. Squalls swept, cleared, and rebuilt, putting a frame around scenes the way a theatre uses light to guide the eye. In one clear window, a destroyer's silhouette showed briefly, then hid. In another, a recon plane flashed and was gone. The wounded ship's guns remained disciplined. Crews stood by their stations, treating each contact as if it could end the world in a minute, because sometimes one shell does. But the quality of their readiness now fought the quantity of problems that steering delivered to every task. When the heavy ships finally came within reach, it was not a cavalry charge. It was a formal approach by men who knew the history of gunnery at sea and respected its cruelty. They wanted angles that made sense, ranges that allowed their own armor to pay for itself, and an enemy whose replies would be sharp but not cunning. A ship that cannot steer cannot choose cunning. It can only choose valor. Valor is worthy. It is not strategy. The first salvos were questions posed by steel, and the answers came in colors that only look like smoke to outsiders. To the men who live under them, those colors mean splinters, shock, and decisions made by physics. In the end, the circle of inevitability is drawn by many hands. the airman who flew low under rain, the sailor who checked the arming wire twice, the destroyer captain who refused to break contact in a squall because contact is a promise, not a convenience, the gunnery officer who set his own pride aside and let instruments do their work, the captain of the wounded ship who tried everything a clever man can try with a stubborn machine and found the sea would not be tricked. The story that began with mockery ends with a kind of respect, because the sea forces even enemies to admire work done well. Standing on the carrier's deck after the reports were tallied, a pilot could look at the watercolor horizon and feel no triumph, only completion. The job had been simple to name and hard to perform. Put a weapon into the water the way the weapon wants. Create a condition the enemy cannot escape. Let the larger pieces of the fleet take the final bow because that is their place in the script. If the world wanted to talk about glamour, it would miss the point. Precision under bad conditions is not glamorous. It is decisive. And on this morning, that decisiveness closed the circle the way a craftsman closes a drawer. Without squeal, without drama, with a fit so exact you almost forget the labor it took to make it slide. Dawn over the Atlantic is not a color. It is a slow admission of shapes. The ocean starts as graphite and then, almost shyly, gives back the edges it borrowed during the night. In that hesitant light, the battered geometry of the wounded battleship could be read as clearly as a confession. She still moved, she still fought, but the way her wake smeared told the truth more bluntly than any signal lamp. Steering was a negotiation, not an order. That single condition redrafted the whole play. Big ships that had spent the night working out their lines in the grey could now set them in ink. The distance shrank until angry splashes would speak a language everyone aboard understood, and the rules of the engagement changed from sprinting and evasion to method and pressure. What fabric and patience had made possible in rain and dusk would be finished now by brass and powder in daylight. On the bridge of one of the closing battle wagons, the morning routine unfolded with a severity that felt almost ceremonial. Coffee went cold beside range tables, scabbed with pencil marks. Binoculars waited for faces that had not yet decided whether to be hard or calm. The gunnery officer stood with his team inside a compartment that looked like an argument between mathematics and ironmongery, speaking in the kind of clipped calm that turns complex machines into willing accomplices. He did not talk about glory. He talked about angle, drift, spread, and the patience to wait for solutions that were not guesses. When he paused, it was not to admire a silhouette through glass. It was to listen to the instruments that, when treated kindly, tell a ship how to write its will onto the horizon. The first salvos were questions asked in steel punctuation. Geysers rose around the enemy, stuttering commas in a sentence that would end with a period you could stand inside. The wounded ship answered with what she had left, and what she had left was still terrifying at close quarters. It is possible, in a moment like this, to forget the chain that led here and start thinking only in terms of exchange. But behind every broadside was the quiet, invisible signature of the previous evening, a single detonation near the stern that turned a captain's certainty into a set of ugly choices. Without steering, speed becomes a trap. With steering compromised, even fine gunnery becomes an art of diminishing returns. The ocean, indifferent and slow to praise, had already marked its decision along the line of wake. Destroyers played their feral part at the edges. They slashed in, let loose teeth of steel, and slashed out before heavy shells could swat them like gulls. Cruisers maintained the geometry, shepherds that carried knives. Overhead, gaps in the indifferent cloud admitted watchful eyes for seconds at a time. The airman who had threaded rain the night before watched from another altitude now, relieved and exhausted, reading the spreads and splashes like scores. In that choir, every voice mattered, but the melody belonged to the long guns that stepped the range inward with implacable grace. There was no hurry. Hurry is where mistakes live. There was only pressure, measured in angles and yards, and the way sound thickens until even the lungs agree to breathe with the rhythm of the guns. The big ships moved in the careful way masters choose when students are watching. They offered angles that pleased their own armor and their own plots. They folded with distance until the problem no longer belonged to tables alone, but to men who could see the other crew's faces in the intervals between smoke. The sound deepened into something you felt in your chest cavity, a slow hammer that persuaded, not merely struck. With each minute, the wounded ship looked less like a decision and more like a duty. An obligation to finish carefully so that no second act could be written by surprise. Sometimes endings are unkind. This one, by the standards of the sea, was almost merciful because the outcome had been earned the night before. Below decks in the target, courage was as thick as the smell of oil. Men hauled on gear that did not want to be moved, spoke with a steadiness that sounded like defiance, because what else can steadiness be when steel is breaking its promises? They carried hose, they carried stretchers, they carried orders from mouths that had no room for poetry. Nothing about their labor was diminished by the fact that it would not alter the end. Heroism is not an alternate physics. It is a way of paying a bill you did not write. In spaces so tight you had to turn your shoulders, men tried to convince metal to postpone its decision and water to wait its turn. For a while, against odds and consultation, they succeeded. Then the arithmetic resumed, as arithmetic always does. Somewhere in the quiet spaces between salvos, the ship began to lose the shapes that made her fearsome in photographs. Superstructure tore. Antennas became loose punctuation. Paint lost arguments with heat and shards. Her fire slackened and then stumbled, and then became a series of stubborn gestures rather than a conversation. She turned when the sea told her to turn, not when a man tugged a wheel with stubborn hands. The surrounding ships felt the change as much as they saw it. You can read despair in the light of gun flashes as easily as in faces. Despair brightens briefly, and then gutters. When the end came, it did not look like a finish line. It looked like a horizon deciding to keep a secret. There were last acts below, choices made about scuttling and saving, about abandoning pride to preserve men, about whether a symbol should sink by enemy shell or by friendly valve. Those are private decisions, but their consequences are public. Water-filled spaces that were supposed to hold air, the bow lifted in protest, or else the stern did, and the ocean took the ship without triumph because the ocean does not perform. Smoke hung, then thinned, then learned to be ordinary again. Silence is never truly silent at sea. But there is a kind that follows the conclusion of a long problem. It is made of exhaust and distant orders, and the soft thunder of waves finding new shapes to trip over. The men on the decks of the victors did not cheer the way paintings imagine. They exhaled, they counted, they checked surviving tasks, they let their ears relearn smaller sounds. Somewhere on the carrier, a pilot who had flown low in rain the night before looked at his hands and finally saw the tremor he had not allowed earlier. None of it felt like triumph. It felt like completion, which is the only honest synonym victory has ever had on water. In the days and years that followed, the story hardened into a handful of sentences people repeated in classrooms and bars. Some were flattering. Most were wrong in ways that hid the dignity of what happened. The first myth claimed obsolete wings pierced unbeatable armor. It is a tidy cartoon, a stitched biplane carving through inches of plate because pluck outruns metallurgy. It ignores how ships actually live and die. The weapon did not burrow through a citadel. It struck where function concentrates and protection thins, near the machinery that converts intention into motion. Armor is a wager placed against certain blows at certain angles. The sea keeps a ledger for the angles you forget to price in. The next myth said any modern aircraft would have done better. Faster, sleeker machines have virtues in clear air and over land. This problem was written by weather and geometry. A torpedo dropped too fast, skips like a stone, and earns a laugh from the ship it hoped to hurt. A torpedo dropped too high spends its early life drunk and wakes after the party has moved. The fabric-winged machine with patient manners flew inside the narrow band that keeps a swimmer sober and straight. On that day, fit beat fashion, and a low stall speed beat a polished brochure. Another myth was born from discomfort with statistics. People who like their heroes neat dismissed the decisive hit as luck. Luck is the word we use when causes are too many for a headline. The causes were there. Repeated attacks split attention. Training shaved the wobble from hands. Doctrine insisted on envelopes and arming distance, even when adrenaline begged for early release. The ocean always keeps a percentage as its fee. The way to tip the odds is not to demand exemption but to offer many fair chances to be paid. A single result can be lucky. A pattern this stubborn never is. There is also the easy sneer that biplanes were useless in a modern war. Struts and wires look comic beside retractable everything. The reality is duller and better. Certain low-speed, high-stability jobs survived the brochure era. Anti-submarine patrols, artillery spotting, short deck work in foul weather, corners of conflict where a gentle wing and patient engine still mattered. If a tool is honest about its limits, and those limits match the day's work, it earns its ration of respect. A bureaucratic myth treats governance as a footnote. Who chose to hazard aircraft in a squall at the edge of night? Who sequenced cruisers and destroyers so contact was never lost but ships were not thrown away? Who said yes to a second strike when the first came home damp and silent? Those choices are not cinematic, so they often go untold. But authority arranged the day. Doctrine gave crews permission to use their strengths and keep trying. Accountability wrote the checklists that made precision possible. None of that fits into a one-liner, but all of it fits into a victory. Another misconception says a single act ends anything. The torpedo hit did not close the book by itself. It opened a chapter the size of a horizon. After steering sulked, destroyers had to hang on with teeth of spray. Cruisers had to keep geometry honest. Big ships had to arrive with discipline, not haste. Weather had to flick windows open and shut without breaking nerves. Endings emerge from the custody chain of many acts, and the quiet ones carry more weight than audiences notice. When the myths are peeled away, the reality is stranger and more satisfying. A modest machine flown modestly in immodest weather produced a change of state. That change altered the menu of choices available to a ship whose terrifying strength was choice itself. Once choice was gone, the rest looked inevitable to outsiders and inexorable to those involved. That is as clean a demonstration of strategy as you are likely to find in a world that resists clean demonstrations. After the shooting stopped, myths traveled faster than reports. The men who strapped into open cockpits that stank of oil and salt knew what really happened. They flew within inches and knots defined by someone who had never met them but understood physics. They counted seconds like prayers. They watched a white seam on grey water lengthen toward a stern that forced itself not to notice. And when the verdict finally arrived, it felt less like triumph and more like relief that precision had spared everyone an extra round of suffering. Reality's last lesson is not that slow beats fast, or old beats new, or audacity beats caution, fit beats vanity. If the job is to deliver a heavy swimmer into its proper element under a low ceiling with rain slapping sideways, the best airplane is the one that does not argue with that job. If the job is to convert a steering wound into a schedule, for heavier friends, the best fleet is the one that passes the baton without tripping. None of that fits on a recruiting poster. All of it works. Wars are not won by sentiment. They are administered. The choices that led to rain-soaked fabric wings lifting off a pitching deck into a squall were not made by poets. They were made by officers whose job is to turn national will into procedures that can survive bad weather, bad luck, and human limits. Governance in this context is not a parliament or a speech. It is the authority chain that says yes or no to risk and then enforces the boring, glorious routines that make risk tolerable. It begins far from the horizon, in training syllabi and procurement lists and fuel allotments, and arrives on a wet deck as a hand signal and a nod. Doctrine did not write all the details of this chase, but it wrote the verbs. Find, shadow, strike again, converge, finish. Under each verb lived permissions and boundaries. Find required patrol patterns, fuel plans, and a way to talk so that bearings mean the same thing to a flying boat and a cruiser captain. Shadow required rules about distance, about when to risk a shell to keep contact, about how to hand a target from one set of eyes to another without dropping it in the sea like a slippery tool. Strike required envelopes, not moods. Release points measured in feet and knots rather than fantasies and adjectives. Converge required escorts that could stomach a long night and heavy ships that could be patient enough to let small teeth do their work. Finish required discipline. Do not arrive out of breath. Do not crowd the geometry. Do not let anger negotiate for you. Within those verbs, governance protected sanity. Checklists are an unfashionable kind of courage, but they are the kind that made a torpedo's entry precise after hours without warmth. The authority that insists on height and speed, even when a man's heart is sprinting, did not arrive in the cockpit by accident. It arrived through training, syllabi, evaluations, and the quiet cruelty of washing out people who could not or would not honor limits. In the hangar, governance looked like an ordnance chief who would not sign a line until the arming wire sat exactly so. On the bridge, it looked like a captain who refused to trade a deck full of airplanes for a rumor of opportunity. Doctrine also handled the politics of fear. After a famous friendly loss, pressure piles up in the lines between shore and sea. Voices demand action that feels like vengeance. Governance converts that howl into tasks that bear fruit. It says, "We will not fight on emotions' schedule. We will fight on the weather's schedule and the logistics calendar." It says, "Stand by to launch when we have contact, and when your altimeter and your throttle agree that this is the sky you were trained for." It rewards the officers who can distinguish a narrow window from a mirage and punishes carelessness that dresses itself as zeal. There is a moral clarity to this kind of administration. It takes responsibility up and pushes credit down. Admirals sign orders that accept the risk of launching fabric and bone into sleet. Petty officers sign off on cotter pins that keep fins aligned. Pilots sign their names to the drop path they chose. When it works, the reward is not a medal alone. It is the knowledge that the system trusted you to be the human face of a policy written by men you will never meet. When it fails, the accountability looks like names read aloud and reports translated into changes that prevent repetition. The pursuit also demonstrated a form of humility rare in organizations that command iron. The big ships did not insist on starring in every reel. They let smaller tools shape the field because smaller tools were better suited to the first incision. Later, when their weight mattered, they arrived not with swagger but with precision. This distribution of labor is a kind of governance that is easy to praise in doctrine and hard to practice under pressure. Pride ruins timing. Restraint keeps schedules honest. In the aftermath, governance has one more job. It turns story into standard. Reports become revisions to training. Diagrams become placards. Vague lessons become checkable items. The chapter in the manual that used to read like a warning now reads like a promise. If you fly inside this band and drop like this under these conditions, the sea will accept your offering and carry it where it needs to go. The crews who come later deserve that inheritance. They deserve to know that their courage will be multiplied by process and not wasted by guessing. Doctrine is often accused of sucking the life out of war. In truth, it sucks the chaos out just enough to let courage do clean work. On the day a humble biplane undid a terrifying ship, governance was the invisible scaffolding that held men steady while they climbed. You can remove scaffolding from a photograph to make the building look prettier, but if you remove it from the work itself, nothing good stands for long. If you were handed this problem in a planning room that smelled of old coffee and wet wool and told you had 7 days to make it vanish, you would not ask for miracles. You would ask for windows, for machines that fly when the barometer has second thoughts, for crews who trust numbers when nerves shake, for a net that needs only one knot to hold. The first week would not be improvisation. It would be rehearsed, response deployed on a clock the sea does not control. Day 1 would be reconnaissance without heroics. Find the corridor, not the exact longitude of the enemy's shadow. Put eyes in the air that can stay when weather glowers. Mark where cloud drops low enough that only certain wings can live underneath. Place cruisers at distances that make losing contact unlikely, even if a squall throws paint across the horizon. Build a radio picture that is spare, redundant and honest about uncertainty. Then stand, down anything that needs clear sky, waste nothing that matters. Day 2 would be rhythm. Launch what can fly. Practice the handoff between ships and aircraft until it looks like a reflex. Let crews sleep in shifts that honor biology. Train the eye to the weather's grammar, because squalls repeat like clauses, and inside those clauses there are commas you can slip through. If a window opens for a strike, take it. If it closes halfway, say so and come back. Courage is not a synonym for stubbornness. Stubbornness is what you have when you run out of ideas. Day 3 would be adaptation. If the first attack taught the enemy how you prefer to approach, write a second preference that lives inside the same doctrine. Vary run-in headings. Adjust the spread so even a clever helmsman cannot build a reliable duke. The goal is not surprise for its own sake. It is to make the enemy solve a new problem while still carrying the unsolved one from yesterday. Meanwhile, keep the destroyer screen honest with fuel and rest, so they can inherit the night without resentment. Day 4 would be patience with teeth. If weather sulks, let it. Use the pause to move heavy pieces onto squares where tomorrow's board will favor you. Respect the logistics chain the way a violinist respects a bow. Torpedoes are not infinite. Good crews are not replaceable at the speed of a briefing. A system that refuses to admit its limits is already writing regret in future tense. Keep the chain tight, and the plan loose enough to bend, not break. Day 5 would be incision. When the window opens again, do not aim for theatre. Aim for function. The target's stern is not a symbol. It is a bundle of necessities. Deliver the swimmer into water like you practiced, within the band, with a release that feels like grace because practice and gravity conspired to make it so. Do not stay to admire your work. Leave the scene to mathematics. If the ship begins to answer her helm with reluctance, the battle has turned, from sprint to shaping. Signal that truth and reposition your pieces for the morning that follows. Day 6 would be custody. Keep contact as if it were a living thing that needs warmth. Let destroyers pluck at edges, and write time across the night with spray and noise. Allow cruisers to be eyes that never assume. Husband the big ships for morning. They are hammers, and hammers do their best work when the wood is already split by a wedge. If the enemy shows anger, acknowledge it and step aside. Anger spends fuel and hope, and the ocean invoices both at compound interest. Day 7 would be conclusion without vanity. The heavy ships arrive not to prove a point but to keep a promise. They take positions that respect their own survival as much as they respect the enemy's power. They speak in salvos that ask questions only one answer can satisfy. They end the threat because ending is their craft. When it is over, the playbook calls for inventory, for letters, for revisions where the week taught something new, for the quiet decency of rest. This is what a first-week playbook looks like when you strip heroics down to tasks. Exactly. Truly so. It is humane because it respects what men can do under rain and stress. It admits that a fabric-winged biplane can be the best instrument on a night when the sky sits low on the water, and that a vast, fast ship can be made docile by a wound that touches the part of a vessel where will becomes motion. It does not sneer at the new or worship the old. It treats both as tools on a pegboard and reaches for the one that matches the work. What remains after the week is not a poster but a habit of mind. You start looking at problems in terms of envelopes and windows rather than wishes. You stop asking for perfect weather and start asking what the present sky will let you do if you fly like a craftsman. You learn to cherish repetition because repetition is how statistics begin to lean in your favor. And when someone says the plan is dull, you learn to hear that as a compliment paid by people who confuse noise with nerve. The last instruction in the playbook is a quiet one. Write it down. Write down the inches and the knots, the failures and the saves, the shape of the squalls and the hour when the sea turned friendly. File the reports so the next crew does not have to reinvent weather, geometry and courage on the same night. The ocean forgets no mistake and keeps no memory, so people must keep it for her. That is how a week's work becomes a guardrail for the next week's work, and how a fabric-winged machine that looks like a relic keeps finding its way into the present tense when the sky sits low and the sea decides who is serious.